that way. In chapter 37, Genesis takes a turn now, and we begin to look at, with some, incredible depth as it relates to one of the sons of Jacob, and his name being Joseph. And this passage here, all the way through to the end, I suppose that next to the book of Job has given more comfort to God's people than maybe any other passage in all of the Bible. Really tremendous. When you are in deep waters and you are in having real difficulties and real trials, and there's that loss of perspective that comes with those kinds of things, it's always good to turn to this account concerning Joseph. It's one of the passages that I ask people to read more than maybe any other passage in counseling when they're in those situations. And occasionally we find ourselves in such situations. But let me say a couple things before we get into this section of Scripture. I think it is encapsulated by a passage in the New Testament in the book of Romans chapter 8. And I ask you to turn there just to build a foundation. I don't know how far we'll get in this chapter if we're going to be building foundations here and there, but we need to do that. From chapter 37 all the way to the end now of the book, it is really puts flesh and blood upon the truth of Romans chapter 8, verses 28 and 29. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. That's Joseph, and that's you and me. And then, lest we should begin to define what we think good is, he moves on and he defines it for us. For whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. God works all things together for good in our lives because we love Him and we're the called according to His purposes, but He defines good as Christ-likeness and not stuff. And so we look at how He works in our lives, and truly He does work it together for good because it makes us like Jesus Christ. Now, if you there's a lot of commentaries on Genesis, and they will get into in great depth how Joseph is a type of Jesus Christ. I'm not going to do that. I think it's tremendous. Sometimes I look at some of that and I just go, okay. Okay, so Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver, and Jesus for 30, and so okay. Wow. I suppose there are minds that really get something out of that. To me, it's a 10 shekel difference. I still didn't. I have trouble connecting here in terms of, and there are, and I'm making fun of some of you that really into this kind of thing. Maybe not intentionally. It would never be my intent to do that, but sometimes the stuff breaks down a little more quickly than I like to see it break down, and all of the weight that we can put on these kinds of things. I think that Joseph is a type of Jesus Christ, and he is a type to the degree that is necessary to communicate this truth. That what God put Joseph through, He put Joseph through to make Joseph like Jesus. And what God puts you and I through, He puts us through in order that we might be a type of Him in one sense, and that we are being conformed into His image. Now, one of the other verse that's important as it relates to this passage, and then we'll move back to it, is in Romans chapter 5. Because God is going to give Joseph very early in his life here, and early in chapter 37, great promises concerning what He's going to do through Joseph's life. These are excellent, excellent promises. But what Joseph doesn't know, and what oftentimes we fail to recognize, is that there is tremendous preparation that can occur between the time that the promises are given to us in terms of God's call upon our life and then the fulfillment of those promises. And all of these things happen to us in order that character might be developed in our lives. And character is not something that's talked about very much today. Character as being some supreme thing, but it's very important to God. And God speaks in Romans chapter 5, and He says, and not only that, verse 3, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance. That is, as we continue to keep moving forward in the trials that are a part of our lives, that are conforming us into the image of Christ, as we move forward, we discover one thing for sure. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. And then perseverance produces or works character, and character hope. And so when I see what He's done in my life back here and how faithful He's been, then I look at the future with a confident expectation. And all the while, between these two things, character is being developed in my life. Define character. Jesus Christ. Again, that's the character that's being worked into our lives. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the genealogy of Jacob. Joseph being 17 years old, kind of a young guy. And he was feeding the flock with his brothers. A hardworking young man, by the way, as we'll see. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. And you can look at this and say, well, the little tattletale. The little snitcheroo, or a little rat. What do we got, But really, as we see his character unfold, that's probably not the case. These sons were probably involved in some activity that was putting the entire family in jeopardy in terms of what they were doing and how they were handling the flocks and these things. And it really strikes at the work ethic and the responsibility and the integrity that Joseph had. He didn't like it, and he came back and he told his dad what in the world was going on. So this isn't a character flaw. This is something. Well, let's turn to Genesis chapter 37, and we will pick up where we left off last week. In chapter 37, we went through the first 11 verses last week, and what we saw there was that Joseph was not the youngest, but the next to youngest son of Jacob, and he was Jacob's favorite. And Jacob apparently, and really an act of, well, certainly not an act of wisdom, decided to broadcast that, and basically, I'm sure his intent was not to rub it in, but he gave him a multicolored jacket that none of the other brothers got, just Joseph. And then God gives Joseph two dreams, and in the dreams they communicate a couple of things. That ultimately he would be the head of this family, and that his brothers would bow down to him one day, and ultimately that even his father and his mother and his brothers would end up bowing down to him. He was going to become the chief someday. That's all there was to it. God gave him those dreams because God knew that he would need those dreams for the trials that he was about to go in. And there is always a process that occurs when God gives us vision of what He has in mind for our lives, and He gives us His dreams in terms of what is going to happen as it relates to our lives, something He plants in our hearts. There is always, between the time that He gives these things to us and the time that they come to full fruition, actually happen, there is a time always of preparation. Always a time of preparation. You and I as Christians are always being prepared. We are being prepared for heaven. We are being prepared to be around that throne of God. We're being prepared as the bride of Christ, and we are also being prepared as it relates to what God has called us to in terms of what it is His ministry in these last days. So there is always going to be preparation, and Joseph is now going to head into a 13-year period of preparation. Now that can make your heart sink, especially if you're in the middle of a trial right now. But this guy is ultimately going to become, in 1 hour, he is going to go from the pit of an Egyptian prison to becoming the second most powerful man on the face of the planet. He was not ready for it at 17. He didn't have the character for it. Wasn't in place yet. He had the character in place to be a 17-year-old. He had the character in place for this and for that, but not for what God had called him to yet. And so there's preparation. There's preparation in our life. The preparation always centers on one thing, and that is godly character. And when God puts us through the trials, the tribulation, the different things that we go through in preparation for greater and greater and greater fruitfulness in our lives, always be sure what He is striving for, what He is moving towards, is greater character in our lives. He's not waiting to put us in the position that He's ultimately going to put us in until we're rich. He's not waiting until we become secure and independently wealthy so that we can then go and do what it is. He's waiting and developing character. He's not waiting until I've developed my pastoral library and then I can head into the ministry. These things He can add into our lives in a moment. They mean nothing to Him. It's nothing to Him to add these things in a second in time. But character takes time. Character takes time. And that's what He's working. He gives the dream. Then He begins the preparation. And the preparation involves the development of character. When we are in trials, it is very wise to say to the Lord, "What character are You developing in me, Lord?" God doesn't put us in trials just to put us in trials. Oh, Dan Konchak hasn't been in a trial for a while. How'd I miss him? Is it time for a trial? No. There's a reason in every trial, and it relates to character. What kind of character? Christ-likeness. Godly character. That's the character that He's bringing out in our lives. And the same thing that Joseph went through, every single one of us as children of God are going to go through. There is no escaping it because there's no fruitfulness, there's no Christ-likeness any other way. And so this is why I think, along with the book of Job, this is one of the most encouraging passages in all of the Bible when we are in trials. Because when we are in trials, typically the first thing I lose is perspective. I don't know what's going on. Doesn't make any sense to me. And so isn't it nice to be able to get a bird's eye view of how God works through the testimony of Joseph so that we can understand how He works and why He works. And so this is what it is that is going on. It's character that is important to God. And then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Now, the last time they were in Shechem, it was a bad scene. They slaughtered the whole city. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem?" He's no doubt concerned about them and how long they've been gone, and maybe some mischief has come their way because of their history related to the city. And he said, "Maybe your brothers are feeding the flock there in Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." And so he said to him, Joseph did, Here I am, send me." And then he said to him, "Please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." And so he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem, 50 miles, probably about a 2-day journey. Now a certain man found him, and there Joseph was, wandering in the field, obviously lost, and looking for something. And the man asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" And so he said, "I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they're feeding their flocks." The man said, "They have departed from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go down to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan, which is about 20 miles. Now, when they saw him afar off, easily recognized by his brightly colored coat that he no doubt wore, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. They weren't going to put him in a headlock and give him a rabbit burn on the top of his head or some typical older brother thing, or, put ice down his diaper or something like that. I mean, they wanted to kill this guy. Pretty intense scene. Pretty intense household. And they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming." That was the sore spot, the dream, that showed them bowing down to Joseph. "Come, therefore, and let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. And we shall see, what will become of his dreams." That'll put the end of his dreams. We'll just kill the guy, throw him in a pit, and his dreams won't come true. But Reuben heard it, the oldest, and he delivered him out of their hands by saying, "Let's not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit," really in a broken cistern, "which is in the wilderness, and don't lay a hand on him." And he said this in order that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. And so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that the first thing they did was they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And they took him and they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. So they've taken this guy and they've thrown him in there, and they want to kill him, and they know they're not supposed, they're trying to devise how in the world should we deal with him other than killing him, and they throw him down into the pit. Now in later on in chapter 42 of this book of Genesis, we find out a little bit more about what Joseph was doing while he was in the pit. And what he was doing was something like this. "Help! Please, let me out! Let me out!" He is pleading with them for his life. And he's begging them, anguish of soul he's pleading from, it tells us, that they would spare his life. He knows he is in deep, deep trouble with these guys. And so they sit down and they eat their lunch, a fairly hard-hearted group, I would say. And they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, which was a very fertile plateau on the east side of the Jordan River in Galilee. And so the Ishmaelites were doing very well, involved in trade, and they came with their camels bearing spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to carry them down to Judah. And so, to Egypt rather. And so Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? We don't make any money off of that. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. And then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now you can imagine this guy. He is just running an errand for Dad. You put yourself in his shoes. He just was going to go and make sure everyone was doing all right. And now here he is pleading for his... You can imagine this guy. He is just running an errand for Dad. You put yourself in his shoes. He just was going to go and make sure everyone was doing all right. And now here he is pleading for his life. And all of a sudden now he's a part of a caravan, sold as a slave, and he's on his way to Egypt. And this caravan that comes along doesn't just happen to come along. God sends the caravan. And yet, in Joseph's mind, it has to be, I'm in this pit. This is a ridiculous thing for me to be in. It can't get any worse than this. Surely they're going to let me out. It's a big practical joke. And the next thing is he finds himself on the way to Egypt. And it looks like everything is completely out of control. Looks like his dream is foolishness headed towards Egypt. And yet God is in it. God is totally 100% in it. He sent the caravan to get this man to Egypt. because he wants him in Egypt, because Egypt is where he's going to teach him the lessons that he needs to be taught. There are no accidents in our lives. I like to think there are. And I like to think that some of the things that come into my life that look especially tragic or especially difficult, or that there's no way God is going to work this together for good, that this puts, that it can be put into some kind of a category that, this will be the one that he won't be able to work together for good. And yet, the testimony of our life is always, by the time we get out of the trial, to realize that he just smothered it in his grace, and he was absolutely faithful, and he did work good out of it. And so this situation just gets worse and worse and worse, but it's by design, because God is digging deeper and deeper and deeper in this man's life. And he is trying to develop character here in Joseph's life, and he is developing it through a pretty tough family. Pretty tough upbringing, I'd say. Sounds like a pretty dysfunctional family to me. This whole thing seems pretty hard on his inner child, if you ask me. And I'm not just taking a cheap shot. I've got to examine these things. These are the things we're being inundated with. He's been raised with 10 cold-blooded murderers and thieves. That's his family. That's his family. His dad has a tendency to drift back into being a con man, a heel catcher, and quite an embarrassment every time he does. And his mom's dead, but his dad still has another wife and some concubines. And here he is in the midst of this kind of a family, in the violence of the family, the hatred of the entire family except for his dad towards him. And now when you think it can't get any worse, he loses the one family he has. He's gone at 17, taken away, stolen away. And so he's raised in the midst of tremendous strife and tremendous difficulties. And I categorically reject the idea that God is not big enough to overwhelm our childhoods and to work it together for good. There were times when I was growing up that I stayed awake all night because I was afraid that somebody in the household would murder us before the night was over. And I could go on for hours and tell you stories. And it doesn't work against you. Because what it develops in our lives is a character and at least a compassion that would not be there any other way. But if somebody wants to come to me and wants to begin to make me to feel sorry for myself, or to spend all of my life back there in that whole scene and trying to figure the whole thing out, I can't figure the whole thing out. And I don't know why all of it happened. All I know is that it brings forth fruit today. And you and I would not be who we are, and even as limitedly fruitful as we are, without the difficult things that were a part of our lives. And so we can go into all of the madness of trying to search all of it out and all, but the bottom line is he who he is? And can he and will he work it together for good? However horrific it might be, yes, he can. Yes, he can. And you have character in your life that would not be there otherwise. It just wouldn't be there. It's not working against you. It's all part of the preparation. And we watch in our lives, if we've walked with the Lord for longer than 2 weeks, and especially the longer we walk with the Lord, we see his hand in our life before we ever surrender to him. We see his grace and how he was working all along. His fingerprints are everywhere. And so is the case in Joseph's life. So was the case. Character being developed in this way. And so he's taken now into Egypt. And Reuben returned to the pit. Apparently he had left for some time while all of this was going on. And Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. He didn't know what had happened to him. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go? I'm the oldest brother. I'm responsible for him. Where's he gone? What are we going to do?" And so now they've got to come up with some kind of a plan here to report to Jacob what's happened to his son. And so they took Joseph's tunic and they killed a kid of the goats and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors and they brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" This is cruel beyond description. You don't do anything harder to a parent than this. There is nothing you can do harder to a parent than this. And he recognized it and he said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without a doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." And Jacob tore his clothes and he put sackcloth on his waist and he mourned for his son many days. And all the sons, what hard-heartedness. This is a cruel group. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. And he refused to be comforted, and he said to them, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." And thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And so now begins a period of 22 years that is going to go by before Joseph ever sees his father again. 22 years this is going to go on, this trial. It is interesting here as you look at this, the Midianites have no use for him. They sell him immediately in Egypt to Potiphar. And the word officer of Pharaoh, their officer, it has the meaning of eunuch. Now, he might have been a eunuch or he might not have been a eunuch, but it can be either way. But he might have been a eunuch, and we don't know. The captain of the guard literally means the captain of the slaughterers. This guy was the head of the executioners there in Pharaoh's court. He's the guy that killed the people or headed up the guys that killed the people who went against Pharaoh. Now, you're reading along in Genesis, and there seems to be some kind of thought progression involved until this chapter. It's like, what happened to Joseph? Why do you got to read all this raunchy stuff for? What's it? Did somebody get a page mixed up here and Moses and the thing? Well, how did that slip in? What in the world is it? Why would that be there? I remember reading this. I thought, what does this have to do with anything? But there is a reason. And what God is communicating, He is showing us. As Judah leaves his family, he becomes absorbed by the world. And God knows that every single member of that family would ultimately do the same thing unless God did something. They were in danger of being absorbed by the world before they ever became what God had intended for them to become, and before He ever got to bless the entire world through them. And so He takes and He shows us what would have happened to this family if He had not begun to do what He was doing through Joseph. Because it is through Joseph that He's going to keep this family together, and He's going to bring them into Egypt, and they are going to go from being just a very large family to becoming a nation. And that's what they needed. They needed a time and a place of being separated from the world so that the uniqueness of their identity would not be lost. Where in the world could that happen in the day of Joseph? Egypt only. Because the Egyptians were in a very protracted period of of greatness. And the Egyptians looked down on everyone else in the civilized world at that time. They would no more have something to do with the Hebrew than, whatever. You finish the sentence. They just wouldn't have anything to do with them. And so Egypt was the place for them to go in. The Egyptians would look at them and say, these are stinking Hebrews. I mean, they would say the same thing about an Irishman. They'd say, these are stinking Irishmen. I mean, it wasn't just Hebrews. It was anybody that wasn't them. And so they could go in there and God would be able to maintain their identity. And so here He gives us a glimpse at how critical was the timing, how important and vitally important for the whole history of mankind, what it was that He was doing in Joseph's life. You and I have no idea how big the picture is as it relates to our lives. We have no idea how big the picture is as it relates to the body of Christ in these days. And so that's why this is here. We're getting now, because it is through Joseph that he's going to keep this family together, and he's going to bring them into Egypt, and they are going to go from being just a very large family to becoming a nation. And that's what they needed. They needed a time and a place of being separated from the world so that the uniqueness of their identity would not be lost. Where in the world could that happen in the day of Joseph? Egypt only. Because the Egyptians were in a very protracted period of greatness. And the Egyptians looked down on everyone else in the civilized world at that time. They would no more have something to do with the Hebrew than, whatever. You finish the sentence. They just wouldn't have anything to do with them. And so Egypt was the place for them to go in. The Egyptians would look at them and say, these are stinking Hebrews. I mean, they would say the same thing about an Irishman. They'd say, these are stinking Irishmen. I mean, it wasn't just Hebrews. It was anybody that wasn't them. And so they could go in there and God would be able to maintain their identity. And so here He gives us a glimpse at how critical was the timing, how important and vitally important for the whole history of mankind, what it was that He was doing in Joseph's life. You and I have no idea how big the picture is as it relates to our lives. We have no idea how big the picture is as it relates to the body of Christ in these days. Chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph. And that's all that matters. That's all that matters. Is not how easy the situation I'm in is, or how difficult the situation is. Am I in this situation with Him? And he was. He was right in the center of God's will. And it was a difficult circumstance and situation that he was in. But God was with him. The Lord was with Joseph. And he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And so Joseph was a successful man. He's a slave. He's a butler. Now, given today's economy, I know that a butler looks a fairly attractive job. Any job looks attractive. Butler, what kind of benefits can we get on that? You include medical? Man, is medical coverage going out? I don't want to get on that. And here he is. I mean, he has gone from the top to the bottom so quickly, and yet God says he's a successful man. Why? What's the definition of success? Doing what God has called me to do today. That's a successful man. Whether he's got 2 cents in his pocket or $1 million in his pocket, that's a successful man. because that's the man who ultimately hears, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord." And no life that does not hear those words can be considered a successful life. He is successful. He is successful. And yet, anybody who would come along and say, listen, if he were to go up to anyone there in the palace there and say, "Hi, I'm a successful man," they'd laugh him to scorn. They'd laugh him to scorn. You're nothing. You're a nobody. You're an insignificant. I'll remember that. I'm going to be second in the world for 13 years. By the time God works that character in his life, he doesn't care to remember. Now, personally, for me, Potiphar's wife would have had a tough time by the time I became second to only Pharaoh in Egypt. I'd call her on the carpet. "Do you remember?" Well, we'll get to that in a moment. You're getting me ahead of myself here. "And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, doing what God had called him to do. And his master saw that the Lord was with him." Successful again. Why? Because it was apparent in his life that God was working in his life. People were seeing that. That's the most important thing. "And that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand." He wasn't where he wanted to be at all there in Egypt. But he worked hard. He worked hard there in Egypt. "And Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had put in, and all that he had, he put in his hand. And so it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he didn't know what he had except for the bread that Joseph served him that day. And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." Here God is developing character in Joseph's life in a very, very interesting way in these first 6 verses. He develops character in his life by making him a slave in Egypt, by putting him in an unjust work situation. He's being taken advantage of. And he's there working for peanuts, for nothing. Everything he touches turns to gold by the grace of God, and he's making minimum wage, less than minimum wage. And it seems like the most unfair situation of all. And he's placed where he desperately doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be a servant there in Egypt. He doesn't want to be in Egypt at all. But it's out of his control. We can find ourselves in the same situations. That's a successful man. Whether he's got 2 cents in his pocket or $1 million in his pocket, that's a successful man. Because that's the man who ultimately hears, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord." And no life that does not hear those words can be considered a successful life. He is successful. He is successful. And yet, anybody who would come along and say, listen, if he were to go up to anyone there in the palace there and say, "Hi, I'm a successful man," they'd laugh him to scorn. They'd laugh him to scorn. You're nothing. You're a nobody. You're an insignificant. I'll remember that. I'm going to be second in the world for 13 years. By the time God works that character in his life, he doesn't care to remember. Now, personally, for me, Potiphar's wife would have had a tough time by the time I became second to only Pharaoh in Egypt. I'd call her on the carpet. "Do you remember?" Well, we'll get to that in a moment. You're getting me ahead of myself here. "And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, doing what God had called him to do, and his master saw that the Lord was with him. Successful again. Why? Because it was apparent in his life that God was working in his life. People were seeing that. That's the most important thing. And that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. He wasn't where he wanted to be at all there in Egypt. But he worked hard. He worked hard there in Egypt. And Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had put in, and all that he had, he put in his hand. And so it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he didn't know what he had except for the bread that Joseph served. And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Here God is developing character in Joseph's life in a very, very interesting way in these first 6 verses. He develops character in his life by making him a slave in Egypt, by putting him in an unjust work situation. He's being taken advantage of, and he's there working for peanuts, for nothing. Everything he touches turns to gold by the grace of God, and he's making minimum wage, less than minimum wage. And it seems like the most unfair situation of all. And he's placed where he desperately doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be a servant there in Egypt. He doesn't want to be in Egypt at all. But it's out of his control. We can find ourselves in the same situations, where God can put us in places, and there we are, such and such an age or whatever it might be. And we have all of these degrees and all of this background and all of this expertise, and here I am working for minimum wage. I'm a slave. I'm doing something that's completely non-technical, something that's way below my expertise and my ability. And they're taking advantage of me. And all of the money that's being made here in this place is being made because of what it is that I'm doing, and none of it's getting passed on to me. And you can get very bitter over situations like that. Very angry. And here I am, stuck in this job, stuck in this place. It's the last place in the world I want to be, and yet I have no control to change it. It looks like it's all working against me, except it's working character in my life. Character in my life. And so you work there for 10 years, or you work there for 6 months, or however many years it might be. You say, look at all the money I lost. I could have been making this over here, and I just don't have to do everything like that. It's all a big waste. God can give you $1 million in a day once He's been able to work the character that He wants to work into our lives. That was the whole issue. And oftentimes, many, many times, history of this church, I've had men come to me, and they're perhaps coming out of prison, or they're coming out of some difficult situation, or they've lived this life of sin and they have no reputation left, and horrible consequences following them or whatever, and now they want to get their life straight, and they're walking with the Lord and all, and the only thing that they can land right now is in their words typically, is this minimum wage job. And I mean, they drive me for that $4-something an hour. And I mean, they work me hard and everything, and it's not fair, it's not right, and what's going on here? And always what I say is this: the great treasure of what is happening in your life, the great wage that you're receiving right now, is not in dollars and cents, it is in character. It's what you're learning between you and God. And it's what you're willing to do between you and God, even when, and working with all of your might, when you should be getting paid maybe 5 times more what it is that you're doing. But you do it with all of your might. Why? Because you're a man of character and you're serving the Lord there. And then when I learn the lessons of character in that place, it's nothing for Him to then move me out of that place if He desires, if He has other plans. And so these situations that seem so working against us, they're not working against us. And God uses this very kind of situation to work here in Joseph's life. Now, notice, please, at the end of verse 6, it says, "And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." Can I just get a show of hands for those of you who consider yourself handsome in form and appearance? Quick show of hands. I thought so. What this means is the guy was just a flat-out hunk. It means that he was one very attractive man. He was not only good-looking in terms of face and all of that, but he was built. He was just what women dream of. And the point is this. If you are a man or a woman and you are of this caliber, handsome in form and appearance, please, I don't know what advantage it is for you to be that, but I know there are disadvantages for you from this situation that God brings out. And that is, you will gather and towards yourself undue attention that is not always good. And if you know that God has blessed you that way, you must be very much on guard as it relates to the type of temptation that is going to come Joseph's way right now. Now, nobody would admit to being that or anything, but you, those of you who are in that category, I suppose you know by the regularity that you get hit on that there must be something to it. But very important account, and important for the rest of us too. Now it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, "Lie with me." Here's Joseph, 17 years old. That's a big temptation for a 17-year-old or a 71-year-old. He's this servant, he's this slave in this other country. He has no position of power at all. He's a very young man, a very attractive man. She is no doubt very attractive. These men did not marry unattractive wives. You were in government and held those positions. She is also no doubt his social superior, an intimidating kind of thing for a young man. And she has the power to make life absolutely miserable for him if he refuses her or embarrasses her in this situation, if he doesn't cooperate. And she tries to seduce him, and she says, "I am available to you, and I want you." Now you think about that kind of a trial or that kind of a temptation for Joseph. Just for a moment, you think about that. Young, the desires of a 17-year-old. She has great, great power. He's in another country. Who would know? And yet he says no to the temptation. Before we even get into the temptation, I think we need to notice one thing. This temptation comes his way right out of the blue. He's not looking for it. He's not asking for this. He's just doing his job. And he has no sense of what's going on in her mind and what it is that she's devising and the plan that she's foists upon him. He's just going about his business, and this trial comes just like that. All of the sudden, in 1 second, this is presented to him. And this is why it is so important in our daily walk with Christ that we do not live near the edge of temptation. And sometimes a temptation or just a blast from the enemy, and I have no doubt that that's what's going on here. He is trying to derail God's plan. He sees what's happening. He understands what's happening here. He knows what's going on. And so he comes in, and if God is working character in our lives, He's aware of it more than anyone, certainly more aware of it than we are aware of it, and He's going to oppose it. And He opposes it with this kind of temptation and other kinds of temptation. And so here this thing comes like a wind, boom, and it hits him. And he's ready for it. He's ready for it. And so often, in the body of Christ, a person will, during the times of like a long kind of period of no ups and downs in terms of temptation, we can begin to drift right towards the edge of the cliff as it relates to what is our weak area, and we all have a weak area. And then when the wind blows down of temptation, if we're right on the edge, there's nothing to hold us, and we go over the edge in the temptation. The people who stand are the ones who walk like Joseph, and that is, he's way away from the edge. And it may hit him, and he may be buckled with surprise for a moment related to it, but he's a long way from the edge. And Satan is very good at lulling us to sleep. And then all of a sudden just blasting loose on us when he spots us near that edge, that cliff. Very, very important. Very, very important to understand. And so he says to her in verse 8, but he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand. And there's no one greater in this house than me, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this wickedness and sin against God? And so it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Joseph says no to this temptation. And it's interesting how he deals with this temptation to me. He doesn't deal with it in some kind of hyper-emotional thing. Any kind of thing. He doesn't head into some, kind of crazed deal of dealing with this temptation that comes his way at all. Not dominated by his feelings, his emotions, or anything, but he deals with it on the basis of his mind. He deals with it as just an act of his will. And as an act of his will, he says to her, no. And so can we adopt a just say no program as it relates to sin, dealing with temptation? We can, but it won't be nearly as effective as we see it operating here, because Joseph not only says no, but he says no for good reason. He has reasons that he says no. There's a reason that he turns her down. And when temptation comes our way, we can't be standing there and looking for a reason to say no. And temptation comes my way, I can't say, okay, I have to say no, or I should say no, or what did my, Sunday school teacher tell me to do here in this situation, and I can attempt to put on Saul's armor, or I can attempt to preach, the Jesus that Paul preaches, or this kind of thing, and I'll just get wiped out, I'll get whipped. He says no, but he says no for a reason, and he says no for good reasons. And he says no for reasons that he had worked out in his heart and mind long before the temptation ever hit. He was ready for it. He was ready for it. He wasn't trying to formulate reasons for saying no to this woman during temptation. Ever try to do that? There's a good reason I should. Oh boy, Satan's too slick for that. And our flesh is too weak for that. To be in the middle of a scene and trying to figure out what I should do and why I should do it. It is either something that is there in my life that a no comes from, or I'm in deep, deep trouble. And he has 3 reasons that he says no to this woman. And these 3 reasons protect him in his time of temptation. And the first reason that he gives, he says no because it wouldn't be right to do this to another human being. It wouldn't be right to do this to your husband. Loving his neighbor as himself. Love for his neighbor as himself. It wouldn't be right. And he realizes that his sin would affect others, and before he does it, he realizes that there would be consequences to this. You think about that. If I have that anchored in my heart, if the greatest and most handsome hunk of a man out of the 5.2 billion people on planet Earth were to come to you and say, "Here I am, and I love you." Or some bombshell. I mean, everything that your fantasy would come and make herself available to you. If I have thought ahead of time of the consequences that sexual immorality would bring into my life, that adultery would bring into my life, it makes it much easier to say no, because it will create an awful lot more problems for a long period of time than a few moments of pleasure will ever bring. It is important to count the cost and to think about what is going to happen based upon my decision here. And so he did. He did. He says, in effect, I don't want to hurt this man. I don't want to violate his trust. You're his wife. I'm not going to do this to him. And he's looking out for his neighbor. The second reason that he doesn't do this is in verse 9 there, where he says, this is great wickedness. This is wrong. And he is personally, genuinely appalled at the sin. What you are asking me to do is great wickedness. 3 cheers for innocence. I was talking with a brother last week on Sunday morning, and he was talking about things that we don't hear about anymore. One of the things that people don't do anymore, you never see them do it on TV, we hardly see them ever do it in any circumstances, is you never see people blush anymore. And there's no blushing in our culture. And blushing is a good thing, a real embarrassment over this and having seen it and being exposed to it and this coming my way. There's a loss of innocence. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. And so here he is. He's innocent, and he realizes this is great wickedness, and it is good to view sin as great wickedness. I would say this. That means for me to have that attitude. And don't dismiss me as a legalist on this issue. But that means, I would say conservatively, 80% of entertainment is just unallowable for me as a Christian. What comes out on 8-track and... Just kidding. Some of the older guys saying, "Oh no, he's flashing back. He's going to talk about albums next." But about 80% of what's there in terms of television and movies and the music and the different things, that Parental Guidance magazine that comes out on Focus on the Family, the latest one had a review of Pyros for Porno, their new album, what that's all about. And then Janet Jackson's new album. And the whole thing is full of sex and oral sex. And I mean, just unbelievable orgasms being simulated, I assume, all the way through the whole thing. And I cannot listen to that and then consider sin to be great wickedness. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And I will not be in Joseph's position of saying, that is wickedness, if that is my steady diet. It won't happen. It simply won't happen. I will be right here. And so here he is. It's wickedness. It's defined as wickedness. And it's important to take and identify sexual immorality as wickedness. It's wrong and it's wicked, along with all of the other different types of things. And so here he takes, and how important it was for him to view sin as sin and sin as great wickedness. It was critical for him to stand. He needed that to stand. We need that to stand. The final reason that he gives is that he recognizes that it would hurt God. There at the end of verse 9. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? After all he's done for me, he's been faithful. He knew God was being faithful. And he says, in light of who he is, I don't want to hurt God as his child. I realize that God is involved in my life. He's with me. He's present. He sees. He has plans. All of these things. And it is all of this, these words that he says, wonderful words there in verse 9. How can I? And it wasn't a thing of, well, let's see now, what would be the profound Christian thing to say as it related to this temptation so that God could take and use that in his writing of the book of Genesis and that I would come across as really a spiritual kind of guy. When this thing comes out, it's like, how can I? I mean, it jumps out. It's who he is. It's his character. It's what's planted in there. It wasn't some kind of thing that he worked out. How could I? It leaps out of him, and it leaps out of him because his heart is prepared, and it comes from the knowledge that I am different. I am different. I am different as a child of God. And yes, it may appeal to me, but I'm different as a child of God. And that's what it comes forth from. We learn from Joseph a very important lesson. You can do it. At 17, you can say no. At 21, I can say no. At 23, I can say no. At 30, at 40, at 50, at 60, at 70, I can say no. I can resist. I can stay pure. And sometimes you need to hear that, because you don't hear that from anyone but God. And we are inundated with information that tells us the opposite. And now we see in recent newspapers, I know I'm going a little longer, I'm aware of it, that in terms of the positions of health services in the United States of America on a federal level, they're going to change their positions as it relates to softening their stand as it relates to abstinence. They're going to move away from that and move more and more and more towards the condoms and towards all of this. And we need to hear this message of Joseph that you can stand, you can stay pure. For those of you who are younger, you must understand, because your life depends on it, your life depends upon it, that the adults who are in the positions of power that be, they are not looking out for you. They are not looking out for you. Only God is looking out for you. And they, dominated by their own flesh and their own lack of self-control and their own thinkings, take and they foist all of these kinds of things on you, and they are laying you by the day on the altar of sexual immorality, the god of Molech. That's where you're being laid, on the altar of the god of lust. And if they don't understand that the devil is real, and if they don't understand that God is real, and if they don't understand that there is light and there is dark and there is a warfare that's going on. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 39 as we continue through this great book of Genesis. And we left off partway through the chapter, and I want to take just a moment to set the context again. God has given Joseph great promises. He's given us great promises. But He's given Joseph great promises. He has given him really dreams. Not just his own dreams, something that has arisen out of his own heart, but God coming to him and revealing to him what he would one day do, not only in his life, but through his life. And there is always that period of time, as frustrating as it is for our flesh, and it's frustrating. But there is always that period of time between when God gives us the dreams and a little glimpse at what it is that He has in mind for our lives, and then that time that takes and goes by between the fulfillment of that time, the fulfillment of those dreams. And during that period of time in between, it is a time that is known as a preparation time. And we want to just be reminded one more time in our own lives, because we all go through the same preparation processes. And that is that in that period of time, God is not interested in us becoming millionaires so that we will be financially secure when He does what it is that He's going to do, or until we have 52 sermons under our belt and can go from city to city and church to church on an annual basis, or whatever we think will be the thing that then finally this will bring the fulfillment of the vision that God has planted on my heart, that soft spot that's there in my heart. No, He is always working in preparation with character in mind. That's what He wants. Godly character. Defined Christ-likeness. And that's what He's doing in Joseph's life. When He gives Joseph these dreams, he's 17 years old. Probably very mature in many ways for 17 years old, but not ready to be the second most powerful man in the world just yet. He needs some character. And so God is preparing him, and God is developing character in his life. And we've seen how God has used a very difficult family situation to bring forth character that would otherwise not be there. We've seen how that he has been unjustly placed into this prison situation and by Potiphar, and he's in this deal, working in this household. He's basically a slave. It's a very unjust employment situation that's going on. He's being oppressed. It's not fair. And yet character is being built into his life. Then Potiphar's wife, as we saw last week, took a liking to him, tempted him. He stood up against the temptation. As we saw last week, he didn't just say no. He said no to the temptation for good reason. We need to say no to temptations that come our way for good reasons, for reasons that have been established in our heart, for reasons that are a part of our character by the time the temptations come our way. And so he has repulsed this advance by Potiphar's wife. And all of a sudden, perhaps he's waiting for some symphony of Bach or Beethoven to come on over the PA there in Egypt. I mean, he's done what God had asked him to do. He's done what's right. Surely God is going to reward that outwardly, and he's on his way now. He's passed the big test. And yet, he is going into even deeper trial than he ever imagined in terms of the difficulty that he had in Potiphar's house. And we pick it up there in verse 13. She takes and grabs his garment and says, "Lie with me." And he flees at the end of verse 12. And he ran outside. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside. Here we have a woman scorned. There's nothing, well, that could only get me in trouble, so we'll skip that. And so she called to the men of her house, these men that she had put out of the house in order that she could get him alone. And now she calls for them and spoke to them and said, "See, he's brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. And he came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." Before we go any further, I want you to recognize, each one of us recognize something very important in that verse. Oh, he, speaking of her husband, brought in to us a Hebrew. What is she doing? She's manipulating the prejudices of the household, of the Egyptians. The Egyptians looked down on everyone at this time. Everyone was a rascal to them. Everyone was a lesser to them in this great time in their history. We've had such times in the history of the United States of America, too. But here she is manipulating prejudice. Be very, very careful in our own lives. Number one, there's to be no respect of persons in the body of Christ. If he'll save you, and he'll save me, we're just thankful, and he'll save anybody. And so there's no prejudice. There's no respect of persons in the body of Christ. And how often, whenever there is this kind of thing where she comes in and says, "This Hebrew," and she stirs up, you know how those Hebrews are, and she begins to stir this whole thing up. Be very careful when you see those kind of situations form before your own eyes and you're being drawn into some stereotype, because oftentimes you are being drawn into something other than what it seems. You're being drawn into a private war. We have no place to be drawn into a private war as members of the body of Christ. And so she takes and she tries to do this, and she accomplishes it. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice as he was trying to force me to lie with him, and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. And so she kept his garment with her until his master came home. And remember, the master is the head of the slaughterers. That's his position in Egypt. This is a scary position Joseph is in right now. You can imagine. You remember as a kid when your mom would say, "Wait till your dad comes home." Oh, what could be worse? Wait till the head of the slaughterers comes home. This would be worse. And so she waits until he comes home, and then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought into us came in to me to mock me." He tried to rape me, tried to lie with me, and this is a complete and total lie. It wasn't anything at all like what it is that she's saying. And so it happened, as I lifted up my voice and I cried out that he left his garment with me and he fled outside. And here we learn that we must be very careful not to believe every report we hear in the news or from the powers that be or whoever, especially when the accusation is being made against proven character. There's something about the flesh that loves to believe the worst. I knew it. I knew that about them. I knew I knew there was something weird about that guy all along. And the flesh likes it. The flesh loves to think evil. But agape love thinks no evil. It doesn't do that. And so here we must be very careful. He believes it. Of course, it's his wife. And so she lays this whole lie out. And so it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, "Your servant did to me after this manner," that his anger was aroused. He took Joseph. Then Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Now, the fact that Potiphar spares his life, to me at least, indicates that he has some suspicions about his wife's character. This is a capital crime, especially when you are head of the slaughters. And so he seems to have some reason to doubt based upon the character of Joseph and the character of his wife. And so here we see Joseph, God developing character in Joseph's life as he is put into the prison of slander, put into the prison of false accusation. And there is hardly a prison that I detest more than that. When somebody takes an incident that you know the truth about and the other person knows the truth about, and only the two of you know, and then they turn the whole thing around and make it exactly the opposite of what it actually was, and then you end up in the pit over it. You end up in the prison over it. This character assassination that occurs. And here is Joseph. He is absolutely he has no power against the corrupt structure that's above him. Not only are the accusations made, but the whole process goes into place. He has no opportunity at all to vindicate himself. You look at something like that and you say, the whole world's against me. This isn't fair. God, I did what was right before your eyes. I fled from this situation. I mean, and now I'm going from a slave in this man's household into an Egyptian prison, which wasn't much of a place to end up. Well, here we learn that we must be very careful not to believe every report we hear in the news or from the powers that be or whoever, especially when the accusation is being made against proven character. There's something about the flesh that loves to believe the worst. I knew it. I knew that about them. I knew I knew there was something weird about that guy all along. And the flesh likes it. The flesh loves to think evil. But agape love thinks no evil. It doesn't do that. And so here we must be very careful. He believes it. Of course, it's his wife. And so she lays this whole lie out. And so it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. He took Joseph. Then Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Now, the fact that Potiphar spares his life, to me at least, indicates that he has some suspicions about his wife's character. This is a capital crime, especially when you are head of the slaughters. And so he seems to have some reason to doubt based upon the character of Joseph and the character of his wife. And so here we see Joseph, God developing character in Joseph's life as he is put into the prison of slander, put into the prison of false accusation. And there is hardly a prison that I detest more than that. When somebody takes an incident that you know the truth about and the other person knows the truth about, and only the two of you know, and then they turn the whole thing around and make it exactly the opposite of what it actually was, and then you end up in the pit over it. You end up in the prison over it. This character assassination that occurs. And here is Joseph. He is absolutely, he has no power against the corrupt structure that's above him. Not only are the accusations made, but the whole process goes into place. He has no opportunity at all to vindicate himself. You look at something like that and you say, the whole world's against me. This isn't fair. God, I did what was right before your eyes. I fled from this situation. I mean, and now I'm going from a slave in this man's household into an Egyptian prison, which wasn't much of a place to end up. What was God doing all the time? He's developing character in this man's life. And Joseph could say, well, do I really need that much character, God? And He probably doesn't even know enough to formulate that question. But we know He needs that much character. And sometimes as I watch the body of Christ, I watch your lives. Hey, we all read one another's lives. We all draw encouragement from one another. And sometimes I see some of you and what you go through. Tremendous trial, tremendous difficulty. And I watch you, and I watch you persevere. And I cry out to the Lord, and I say, Lord, I wonder what in the world you have in mind for this person. The character that you're developing in them. The kind of fruitfulness that you're going to bring out of them. Oh, strengthen them, Lord. Strengthen them in the midst of this trial. It isn't the need, really, the need of the hour for men and women in the body of Christ with character. Isn't the great lack? Isn't it a wonderful thing to run into men and women in the body of Christ, oftentimes older saints, who've walked through the different things, and they can come along and they have this testimony that is such an encouragement to us. And so he has no idea what God is preparing him for. You have no idea what God is preparing you for. He has a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of a snapshot. You may have a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of a snapshot. But here it is. He goes deeper, because that foundation is going to need to be deeper in his life. God is going to do it. And so these slanders, these lies that come against him. It's interesting to me that Jesus writes, in the Sermon on the Mount, rather, he speaks, and he says to us at the end of the Lord's Prayer, really it's the disciples' prayer, and he said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you." Oh, how happy you are. How blessed you are. And say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. That's exactly what's happening here. Oh, I don't like it when people say false things about me. And they do. I'm amazed at what I've said that I've never said. And he says, "Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So, kick up your heels for joy. And the first thing that pops into my mind is, what are you talking about? Nothing could be worse than that. Oh, yes, there is something worse than that. Because Jesus speaks to us and he says, "Woe be unto you when all men speak well of you." You be careful when Potiphar's wife speaks well of you. We are as well known by our enemies as our friends. There are those who ought to look upon us with great concern in terms of what we stand for and what we're about and what God is building into our lives. And so there's always going to be the persecution. There's always going to be the mocking. There's always going to be the slander. But I think one of the great challenges is how not, as we grow in our walk with the Lord, how not to be so thin-skinned, to toughen up a little bit in terms of what we can take that's being said against us, and yet at the same time maintain a soft heart. Who's sufficient for that but the Lord? He's the only one that's sufficient for that. The work of His Spirit in our hearts. And so here he is. He is in a very, very, very difficult place. And I can imagine as he goes down into this pit, this Egyptian prison, I mean, you can imagine. You can't imagine. We can't imagine what it would be like. I mean, just they weren't. I doubt they had the television and a fax machine and different things like that in there. And can you imagine how foolish he must have felt over his dreams? Can you imagine what a dumb idiot he must have felt like for telling his brothers and his father and his mother and his brothers those dreams? I mean, it seemed like the dumbest thing in the history of mankind. And yet he was right on schedule. Nothing was going to hinder him. Nothing was going to hinder him, what God was doing in his life. And so here he is, put into this place. There he is. But the Lord was with Joseph, and that's all that matters, and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all of the prisoners And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all of the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. He runs the prison. And it's interesting, there's no note of really God, of Joseph here, heading into any kind of a funk or anything like that. He's now into this place, and so he gives himself, completely to it, to just serving the Lord in this particular place. I read a quote by Vance Havner a while back, and I thought it was just so excellent. And he said this. He said, "It's been said that the mark of deep spiritual maturity is to be able to enjoy the journey when God puts you on a detour." And I think that's the truth of it. I'm usually trying to bang down the bus door. I'm on a detour. I'm on the wrong train. Stop this thing. Get this thing turned around. And yet it's true. That maturity that looks and says, well, I'm going to go ahead and enjoy the ride that I'm on. God's in charge here. And so he begins to do. And whatever it is, wherever he's placed, he just begins to serve the Lord. And the keeper of the prison didn't look into anything that was under Joseph's hand because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And it came to pass, after these things, that the butler and the baker, no candlestick maker here, of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And so rabbinical tradition is that somebody made an attempt on Pharaoh's life, and they narrowed it down to one of these two guys. We don't know. But I just wanted to say the word rabbinical. Just kidding. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, and the chief butler and the chief baker. And so he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, in Potiphar's prison, the place where Joseph was confined. How about that? And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them so that they were in custody for a while. Great humility. He serves them. The next group to serve. And then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. Great sensitivity. And Joseph, what was the first thing that he said as he saw their sadness? Well, you guys think you're sad. Let me tell you my story. I'll tell you sad. Yeah. No, he didn't do that. Very concerned for their condition. And so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We've each have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." And then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, probably knowing that he is innocent and thus eager to hear what it is that God has to say. And he said, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it." Now, we get a little instruction here concerning visions and dreams, too, a little bit. I mean, you think about that. If you received that dream there to interpret it, I mean, you'd want God's interpretation of this. You wouldn't come up with what Joseph's going to come up with, what God was saying that it means. Again, they must be very careful concerning pot shots at things. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. Now, we get a little instruction here concerning visions and dreams, too, a little bit. I mean, you think about that. If you received that dream there to interpret it, I mean, you'd want God's interpretation of this. You wouldn't come up with what Joseph's going to come up with, what God was saying that it means. Again, they must be very careful concerning pot shots at things. And he said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it's well with you. And I mean, this is very touching. I mean, okay, you're going back to the powers that be. He desperately wants this trial to end. I mean, you can feel his heart here. Okay, you're going to get back to that place and everything. Please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. And then the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, and he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there I had 3 white baskets on my head, and the uppermost basket there was all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. And so Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you in a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. I think he was hoping for something a little different than that, but that he was the guilty party. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now this is interesting to me, this chapter 40, because you think, well, why in the world does God do this with Joseph? And the first reason is obviously he is setting the stage for bringing Joseph forth into Pharaoh's court in a couple of years. But I think there's more to it than that. And what God is doing to Joseph is he is encouraging him. Joseph, I gave you dreams when you were 17 years old. And those dreams are going to come true, my son. And he's probably, perhaps, doubting that these dreams are going to come to pass. And so he sends these 2 men in, and God could have accomplished whatever he wanted with these men, but he allows Joseph to be the one that he uses to interpret the dreams. In other words, he's communicating to Joseph, Joseph, you're hearing me, like you've always heard me. You're right on schedule. I'm with you. In other words, the Lord took and put his fingerprints all around Joseph's situation so that Joseph could be reminded that the Lord was with him. And the Lord does that in our lives, especially while we're waiting. Especially while we're waiting. And he'll just do that little special something, or he'll use us, or there'll be some kind of thing that happens, and you realize that it's him. And I'm not yet where I want to be, and I'm not yet where I think God is going to use me in all of this, but he's using me in this way. It's smaller than what I'm hoping for maybe someday, what he's planted in my heart in terms of aspirations. But he encourages him just in using him in this way. And I think it's very important to slow down enough to recognize the Lord's fingerprints when he puts them there. And of course, the pace of life that we live is not so good for slowing down. But I think I am a great fan of journals. When not to sit down and force myself to write something each day, but whatever a person wants to do related to it. But when God does something that's obviously him, or speaks something to me that's obviously him from his word, I like to write it down. Because I need that. Because it's going to be about 2 more years before he sees anything resembling these kind of fingerprints again, at least as it relates to the account. And so that sensitivity to just the presence of the Lord, he needed it. God gave it to him, was very, very important. God knew he would need it. And so here this man is lifted up and the other one is hanged, and yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Oh no! The Bible talks about hope deferred. Oh, this would be terrible. And I can imagine Joseph's there, and as the butler's put back in his place, and he's, I'm going to be called out of here any day, any minute they're going to call me. Hey, I just know that butler's going to go before Pharaoh and say, you can't believe what a talent you've got there in prison. What are you doing wasting him there? Bring him on the scene. And then maybe a few days go by, and I can understand why I would be overlooked for a while. After all, Pharaoh's having a large party. They're all probably pretty busy. So immediately after that, and then days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into months, and months turn into years. It's easy to read about 2 years. Realize that's how much time goes by. It's another thing to live it. And then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. I think that it is very important, and I want us just to pull over to a verse that talks about this waiting just a little bit. And it's over in Isaiah chapter 64. I think it's an important verse for all of our lives as Christians and in our walk with the Lord. And what Joseph is going to learn in the length of this trial is basically this: that while we are waiting, God is working. And I tend to think of waiting as the biggest waste of time. I'm a doer. I'm a mover. I want something to happen, even if it's wrong. And then I want to give it to one of the assistant pastors. But I want to